as of right now. So we're going to go in the order that was presented on the website. So we're going to start with Meagan, and then we're going to go to Vanessa, and finally we're going to end with Yutaka, followed by a Q&A period. So would ask that you, if you want to ask questions, you can always put them in the chat at any time, but we will wait until the end to get to those. Just to give you a bit of a sense of who the winners are this year, I've got bios for each of the presenters, and I will present those now rather than sort of doing it throughout. So Meagan Greentree, who's going to be going first, is a program and policy analyst with Manitoba Transportation and Infrastructure in the Corporate Strategy and Planning Branch. Her previous employers include the Department of National Defence and Transport Canada. Meagan is also a former graduate fellow of the North American and Arctic Defence Security Network. Prior to joining the public service, she served in leadership positions with several nonprofit organizations and veterans boards. Meagan completed a master's in public administration from the University of Manitoba in 2021. The research paper she'll be discussing today is her capstone graduate project, and that is titled Modernizing the Governance of Passenger Vessel Operations in the Canadian Arctic. Our following Meagan will be Vanessa Vertz. Vanessa is a master's in public administration student who will be completing her degree in June 2022. She's currently employed as the executive assistant to the president of the University of Winnipeg. And in fact, a previous Condo Award winner also held that position. So that is clearly a position that recruits at a very high level. In 2021, Vanessa was awarded the University of Winnipeg Graduate Assistantship, where she worked with 2 university professors researching and analyzing K-12 education policy across Canada related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Past work experience includes positions at the University of Manitoba, the Children's Hospital Research Institute, Canada's Royal Winnipeg Ballet, and teaching English in Japan and South Korea. Vanessa has a Bachelor of Arts degree with a major in English and aspires to work as a policy analyst with the provincial or federal governments once her master's degree is complete. Following Vanessa will be Yutaka. Yutaka Dirks is currently a master's student in political science at York University, where he was awarded the Packer Award for Social Justice. He holds a BA in Honors in Political Studies from the University of Manitoba and has been active in political advocacy dealing with housing and homelessness for the past 25 years in a number of nonprofit and volunteer organizations based in Calgary, Toronto, and now Winnipeg. He currently chairs the City Issues Working Group of the Right to Housing Coalition of Manitoba. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over now to Meagan, and I will share the screen so you can present me.
All right. Sorry, I had some technical issues there. Good afternoon, everyone. Big thanks to IPAC Manitoba for giving me another opportunity to discuss my capstone project, as this issue is very near and dear to my heart. To provide a broad overview of what I'm going to be discussing today, my paper examined how the uncoordinated governance of passenger vessel operations in the Canadian Arctic has produced a really unnecessarily complex permitting system that represents a significant impediment to the development of Canada's Arctic cruise tourism industry. So I utilize regulatory process mapping, an international jurisdictional scan, and multidisciplinary literature review to reevaluate Canada's Arctic maritime governance structure and requirements. And my ultimate recommendation is that an Arctic Maritime Coordination Entity be established under Transport Canada's portfolio to foster a vertical integration of services between federal departments, horizontal integration of services across jurisdictions, and a more effective co-management framework for Canada's polar cruise tourism industry. So to get started, I'll just provide a quick overview of how climate change is impacting shipping in the Canadian Arctic. Next slide, please. So the escalating disappearance of ice in the Arctic is having a measurable impact on the volume of Arctic shipping. Previous research has found that vessel traffic in the Canadian Arctic has tripled between 1990 and 2015, and much of that growth has occurred in the last decade. It's really difficult to determine what percentage of vessel traffic growth can be attributed to cruise and adventure vessel activity, because only fragments of this data is captured independently by assortment of different government departments and organizations, including Parks Canada, the Canadian Coast Guard, and the territories. But between 2005 and 2006, it's estimated that the average number of Arctic cruises doubled from 11 to 22. And more recent cruise data from Nunavut suggests that the traffic has since stagnated at roughly 23 to 25 annual voyages for the last several years. So Canada's cruise tourism industry has grown at a considerably slower rate compared to neighboring Arctic states, and Canada currently represents just a really minuscule share of the Arctic cruise market. And both industry stakeholders and previous academic research articles support the notion that Canada's convoluted regulatory and permitting framework shares responsibility for the industry stagnation. And before we kind of look at all these different permitting requirements, I'm going to just provide an overview of the governance arrangement in Canada, which is quite unique. Next slide, please. So Canada's Arctic Maritime Governance Framework is very complex. Over 55 federal, territorial, regional, Indigenous, and local organizations share responsibilities for co-managing various aspects of commercial maritime activities. The legislative framework, which informs this governance network, includes 25 federal acts, 14 territorial acts, and 21 land claim agreements. In terms of jurisdictional responsibilities, roughly a dozen federal departments and agencies participate in this system. The federal government's broadly responsible for developing policies, enforcing regulations, and providing services pertaining to this traditional maritime regulatory triad, which touches on the economy, maritime safety, and the marine environment. So Transport Canada is, for all intents and purposes, the lead maritime entity within the federal cadre, as it's responsible for the bulk of maritime safety policies and regulations. But Transport Canada is also dependent on many other federal departments for both the provision of national shipping services and the enforcement of its regulations. For example, the Coast Guard, under the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, provides icebreaker escort, vessel traffic management, position reporting, and other communications, as well as pollution incident response, while Environment and Climate Change Canada provides marine ice information service and marine weather warnings, and search and rescue services are provided by the Canadian Armed Forces, along with the Coast Guard. Additionally, the RCMP responds to search and rescue events in the Arctic, owing to their permanent presence in the region. Aside from the fractured federal division of responsibilities, Canada's Arctic passenger vessel governance arrangement is also highly decentralized. So the territorial governments are responsible for managing a variety of elements, including the marine environment, wildlife, the regional economy, which includes the licensing of extraterrestrial corporations and crew labor. And both federal and territorial governments share responsibilities for managing cultural resources, particularly with respect to ensuring that passenger vessel activity doesn't cause negative socio-cultural impacts on northern residents. Additionally, the waterways in the Canadian Arctic are subject to over a dozen land claim agreements and modern treaties, which have established co-management boards and formal regional Inuit and Indigenous organizations. And so while the terms and conditions of these agreements vary, the resulting governance bodies generally participate in the management of passenger vessel traffic through land use planning, environmental screening, water licensing, and wildlife management. So to summarize, Canada's Arctic passenger vessel governance model possesses several really unique characteristics which increase the requirement for effective interagency coordination. However, I think as the following slides will demonstrate, Canada's polar cruise requirements really offer ample evidence that this entire governance network is really devoid of rational mechanisms to coordinate its activities. So before we dive into this, I think a general disclaimer that specifies the scope of my research is necessary. First, I accept the merits of the permits and the regulatory requirements at face value. The polar marine environment is very fragile, And shipping in the Arctic is very hazardous. So I don't question the merits of this. Additionally, the Arctic's extensive array of land claim agreements and modern treaties rightfully add another layer of complexity to navigating the Arctic. So my research, doesn't evaluate the merits of these requirements, and instead it just looks at how all these different requirements have been implemented, really from an industry perspective or a client service delivery perspective. So next slide, please. So cruise vessel requirements vary depending on a multitude of factors. So the next 3 slides are just intended to provide, kind of a quick snapshot, which outlines the various organizations that vessel operators will need to contact if conducting a cruise through the Northwest Territories and Nunavut. And these requirements have been cross-referenced with Transport Canada's recommended timelines for operators to initiate various permit or approval processes. Next slide. I should also note that I've mapped the permitting process linearly here to try to make sense of it. But in actuality, acquiring all relevant permits and permissions to conduct a cruise in the Canadian Arctic, it's not a linear step-by-step process. Some of these organizational requirements take months to obtain and require a significant degree of ongoing information exchange between the operators and the responsible department. Next slide. Finally, it's relevant to note that this crude little process map only includes pre-departure requirements. There's a litany of reporting requirements that must be fulfilled while transiting through Canadian Arctic waterways, as well as post-trip reporting requirements, which aren't captured in these slides. Next slide, please. All right, so I don't have time to discuss all of the issues, but I'm going to talk about some of the more notable ones with this entire permit process. The most immediately glaring issue is the length of time required to obtain all required permits and permissions. So Transport Canada advises these vessel operators to initiate consultations with each Nunavut hamlet they hope to visit 24 months before their intended voyage departure. And this is a really important first step in the permitting process because proof of consultation and community approvals are required before the Nunavut Planning Commission will evaluate an application. But the logistics of actually contacting the remote hamlets to acquire permissions is very challenging for a multitude of reasons, including unreliable telecommunication infrastructure, so their internet often doesn't work. Additionally, there's high turnover in community tourism positions, which makes it difficult for operators to form sustainable relationships with communities. Permit requirements also vary considerably depending on many factors. So for operators to kind of successfully navigate this system, they have to have a really intimate understanding of the dozens of acts and regulations to identify their voyage requirements. And aside from several permits and applications offered by the territorial governments on their websites, a few other permits, certificates, license applications are digitized or located online. So operators have to initiate contact with every single organization to acquire it, the documentation that's required of the permit applications. I think the biggest issue is the amount of redundant requirements and undue administrative burdens that are kind of interwoven throughout this whole process. For example, vessel operators are encouraged to submit an itinerary and applicable vessel information to Transport Canada 18 months prior towards their intended voyage departure. And Transport Canada doesn't share this information with any of their federal counterparts. Instead, the operator has to resubmit the exact same information to almost a dozen different departments on staggered occasions throughout the permitting process. And this includes the Canadian Coast Guard, the Canada Border Service Agency, Global Affairs Canada, the Canadian Armed Forces, Health Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And aside from these federal authorities, operators must also resubmit their itineraries and similar information to various territorial departments and local hamlets, as well as hunter and trapper organizations. And federal departments don't even share vessel or voyage information between their own branches. For example, rather than submitting an itinerary to a single point of contact within the RCMP, the vessel operator must contact each territorial RCMP detachment and thus has to discuss their voyage and answer the same lines of questions over and over and over again. Territory and regional and local requirements are also unharmonized. Although I suspect I don't have time to get into that, so we'll go to the next slide. And I think this slide really helps to contextualize, the sheer quantity of administrative burden placed on vessel operators that attempt to organize a cruise in the Canadian Arctic. So I've compared Canada's processing time, the number of interfaces, and the requirements put on operators to the more developed polar cruise tourism industries of Russia and Norway. Again, a little bit of caution is out here before we make direct comparisons. Bear in mind that Canada's power sharing arrangements with Northern Aboriginal communities are unique to Canada, and co-managed regimes just inevitably increase the complexities of designing streamlined requirements. For example, Russia's Northern Sea Route Administration does not consider the cultural impacts of passenger vessel operations to its 26 Northern Indigenous communities. So there are some limitations when we're comparing these permit systems, as Canada's requirements are inevitably more cumbersome. But I think that shouldn't dissuade us from trying to streamline a system that is grossly inefficient. So overall, Canada's Arctic cruise requirements are remarkably costly and labor intensive relative to other Arctic states. It's difficult to estimate the average administrative burden placed on cruise operators because, again, the requirements vary considerably. However, researchers have previously validated that one vessel operator had to send over 3,000 emails and submit 603 documents to obtain all required permits and permissions for the 2016 cruise season. Another operator reported in the same study that to acquire all necessary permits within a given season, they must either hire a full-time employee for a 6-month period or a part-time employee year-round. So while this is somewhat anecdotal, this suggests it costs some cruise companies roughly 960 hours of labor to navigate Canada's permit system annually, and that, never mind the cost of the actual permit fees. In comparison, both Russia and Norway's permit systems are offered through an online single window service delivery model. To conduct a polar cruise in Russia, operators just submit a 2-page application and attach copies of 11 international safety certificates. And in Norway, operators submit a vessel questionnaire and traffic notification electronically via an online application. All right, so what is the solution? Next slide, please. I recommend the establishment of an Arctic shipping coordination entity under Transport Canada's portfolio. The specific organizational form and arrangement of this alternative service delivery mechanism was outside the scope of my research and would require more study. However, I argue that this entity's purpose would be to serve as a client-centric umbrella organization, which could better coordinate the delivery of Arctic maritime services across governments and departments. And it could supplement the client service delivery and policy functions, which have been chronically and somewhat inevitably neglected under the existing Arctic passenger vessel co-governance arrangement. I argue that the mandate for the Arctic Maritime Coordination entity would be to develop an efficient, safe, sustainable, and culturally aware Arctic cruise tourism industry. And I think this institution's responsibilities should include the ongoing harmonization of maritime policies, permit procedures, and vessel operation requirements. Additionally, it could be responsible for developing accurate information instruments, such as cruise vessel operator guidelines, just by virtue of its service functions. And I think that the service functions could include acting as an internal information and communication channel, whereby all policy, regulatory, and service delivery changes that any organization makes within this governance network can be funneled. And other internal information channel functions could include coordinating with the various stakeholders to capture and monitor traffic vessel data, which would allow for more enhanced evidence-based Arctic maritime policy development. This entity could also provide a client service delivery function by assisting the cruise industry navigate Canada's ever-evolving Arctic passenger vessel permit requirements. And most importantly, I think this new entity could foster collaborative partnerships to build capacity across the spectrum of all stakeholders. For example, this entity could improve cultural management functions by partnering with local Inuit and Indigenous stakeholders, and to offer a permanent platform to host reoccurring cultural awareness training seminars for vessel operators. And these seminars could replace Transport Canada's current cultural management practice, which is the distribution of a single-page document to inform vessel operators of respectful cultural practices or behaviors while visiting Nunavut. Additionally, by providing a permanent platform for stakeholder collaboration, this entity could help foster relationships between cruise operators and local hamlets, which would create a more sustainable relationship building framework than the current ad hoc practice. So in short, an Arctic Maritime Coordination entity would serve as an all-encompassing liaison agency, which would foster the capacity for all of the Arctic passenger vessel governance stakeholders. And the last slide here, like a good student, I have to address counter arguments. So I think a likely criticism against the establishment of a new coordination institution is that the current volume of passenger vessel traffic in the Canadian Arctic does not warrant the costs of establishing or operating a new agency. So I argue that Canada has a long tradition of establishing transport crown corporations and ASD mechanisms as policy instruments for nation building. In fact, Transport Canada's current portfolio includes dozens of ASD organizations and crown corporations and administrative agencies, including the Canadian Port Authorities, regional piloted authorities, etc. And the motivating force behind many of these organizations was as tools for economic and regional development. And I argue that the Arctic region is a region that's long overdue for nation building. But the other thing is that the massive inefficiencies produced by the existing governance model are not without cost. So if you recall that one operator had to submit over 3,000 emails and 603 documents to obtain all permit requirements in 2016, and that many of these information exchanges were completely redundant. And then you multiply the enormous bureaucratic effort on the receiving end of those submissions by roughly 25 annual voyages. And in my mind, it raises serious doubts whether the status quo is actually more cost effective than establishing a small agency that has a mandate to reduce inefficiencies. I also argue that an Arctic Maritime Coordination entity would support other federal priorities in the Arctic, which includes strengthening Canadian sovereignty for the Northwest Passage. So, of course, Canada's territorial claim over the Northwest Passage is disputed by the international community. I think, as this presentation has highlighted, because Canada is incapable of competently managing commercial maritime activity within its disputed territory, I think this undermines the legitimacy of Canada's claim with the broader international community. And I argue that instituting a legal basis for an Arctic Maritime Coordination entity would send a strong message to outside stakeholders regarding Canada's commitment to the region. Additionally, the establishment of a comprehensive polar maritime permit system would improve Canada's ability to exercise jurisdiction over the passage and enhance the legitimacy of Canada's asserted rights to govern the region. And the final argument in favor of establishing a new ASD mechanism to address Canada's Arctic maritime governance problems is that such an entity could be designed through any number of innovative arrangements to mitigate the risks associated with the entity's establishment or to satisfy national requirements. So just, one example is that the entity could be designed to facilitate reconciliation through the inclusion of legislative provisions which ensure that regional Inuit or Indigenous organizations were included in its governance structure. And I also argue that, designing this entity's governance structure to include representatives from each jurisdiction may help to mitigate potential resistance from internal stakeholders, which would be one of the biggest risks in establishing this, and foster future cooperation between various departments and authorities. And that wraps up, I think, my arguments in favor of establishing an Arctic coordination entity.
Okay, thank you, Meagan.
Thank you.
If anyone has any questions that's burning, please throw them into the chat. We will hopefully have time at the end for those. But for now, we'll go on to Vanessa.
Thank you, Meagan. That was a great presentation. I'm just going to share my screen. All right, so today I'll be presenting my research paper entitled Examining Welfare Regimes at the Subnational Level, a Roadmap to Universal Childcare and the Reduction of Inequality in Canada. To begin, I'll briefly outline Gösta Epstein-Anderson's welfare regime theory, which is the analytical framework I use in my paper. So Gösta Epstein-Anderson is a Danish sociologist, and his theory contains three major arguments. First, he classifies welfare states into three regime clusters: conservative, liberal, and social democratic. For the purpose of my paper, I focus on the liberal and social democratic welfare regimes. In his second argument, he discusses the terms decommodification and commodification. He defines decommodification as occurring when a service is rendered as a matter of right and when a person can maintain a livelihood without reliance on the market. Decommodification is primarily found in social democratic welfare regimes. And this is due to the universal policies often in place that reduce the need for residents to rely on employment income in order to receive basic services such as childcare. And commodification is the opposite of decommodification. The third major argument is that welfare regimes rarely change. So for example, a liberal welfare regime today is a liberal welfare regime tomorrow, and so forth. So in this slide, we can see some of the major differences between liberal and social democratic welfare regimes. Liberal welfare regimes contain means-tested, modest benefits that cater to low-income groups. They often have strict entitlement rules, which perpetuate social stigma and require a resident to be reliant on the market. Comparatively, social democratic welfare regimes tend to offer universal programs that have a goal of equality for all citizens at their core. The lower income groups enjoy the same rights as the middle and higher income groups, and they are decommodifying in that a person is substantially emancipated from market dependence. So I start my paper with my research question. Should Canada be classified as a liberal welfare regime according to Gösta Epstein-Anderson's welfare regime typology? Epstein-Anderson classifies Canada as a liberal welfare regime, despite the fact that Canada is a diverse country that is highly decentralized. Social policy is notably in the provincial and territorial government's jurisdiction, and it varies drastically based on which one of the 10 provinces and 3 territories a person lives in. I use the example of childcare policy in Quebec and Ontario to show the stark difference in social policies that exist within Canada. In my thesis, I argue Canada cannot be classified as a liberal welfare regime according to Epstein-Anderson's typology. I advance this argument based on the decentralization of social policy power to subnational governments in Canada. As a result, the provinces and territories must be examined individually to classify their welfare regimes. So to illustrate my thesis, I conduct 2 comparative studies. The purpose of these studies is to show that there are 2 distinct welfare regimes that exist within Canada: a social democratic welfare regime found in Quebec and a liberal welfare regime in Ontario. I chose Quebec because it has the lowest childcare fees in Canada, and Ontario because it has the highest for both infant and toddler care. In my first comparative study, I compare Quebec's model of childcare to Sweden's. I chose Sweden for 2 reasons. First, Epstein-Anderson identifies Sweden as a socially democratic welfare regime. And second, Sweden is often looked to as the golden standard for childcare models. My second study compares Ontario's childcare model to the United States. I chose the United States because Epstein-Anderson identifies it as the state most fitting his definition of a liberal welfare regime. So next, I'll give a brief overview of the 4 childcare models I examine within my paper. And I start with Quebec. So Quebec's childcare model offers subsidized, non-subsidized, and in some instances, childcare free of charge. For subsidized care, Quebec has a universal flat rate fee of $8.50 per day per child. All forms of childcare in Quebec must provide children with 1 meal and 2 snacks per full day of care. Childcare can be offered for up to 10 hours per day, and each child is entitled to 261 days of care per year. In non-subsidized care, the fee per day is set by the childcare provider. The provincial government offers a refundable tax credit to parents who use non-subsidized care. And I condensed the tax rate table for 2020 in the upper right corner of this slide to show the highest and lowest income eligibility requirements, as well as the percentage of the tax refund a family is eligible for based on their annual income. Lastly, Quebec offers childcare at no cost to families who receive other forms of social benefits. Quebec's model of childcare closely resembles the Swedish model, which is socially democratic. So in Sweden, childcare is within the municipal government's jurisdiction. The municipality must provide a childcare space for a child within 4 months of a parent's request for a space. Children 3 and over are entitled to 525 hours of care per year at no cost. And all other childcare fees are based on Sweden's maximum fee policy. This is a table showing the preschool fees in Sweden for 2020. Childcare fees are based on a percentage of the family's income up to a maximum amount set by the government. For example, one child in care will cost a parent 3% of their annual income up to 1,478 Swedish krona per month, which is approximately $215.17 Canadian. In comparison, Quebec has set a monthly rate of $179 per child per month. In Sweden, childcare fees decrease as the amount of children in care increase, with the 4th child and above receiving care free of charge. There are discernible similarities between the Swedish model of childcare and Quebec's model of childcare. Namely, they both have universal childcare programs with government-set, low-cost fees rooted in legislation. Being universal, they both promote equality, offering the same low fee to all residents, and in some cases, care at no cost. Lastly, they are both rooted in decommodification. A parent does not need to work in order to access childcare. This is not the case in Ontario or the United States. Ontario's model of childcare is heavily based on providing fee subsidies. They offer the Ontario Child Care Fee Subsidy and the Ontario Child Benefit. The maximum amount a family can receive per year through the Ontario Child Benefit is $1,461. To receive the full amount, a family's income must be equal to or less than $22,303 per year. In this slide, we can see the median infant care costs for major cities in Canada as of 2019. Notably, the 5 cities with the lowest infant fees are all found in Quebec. At the opposite end of the scale, the bottom portion of this slide, the highest fees for infant care in the top 7 cities in Canada are all found in Ontario. Quebec's fees are the set $179 per month, compared to Toronto's fees of $1,774 per month. If you factor in the maximum amount of the Ontario Child Benefit here, it wouldn't even cover 1 month of infant care in Toronto. The impact of these high cost fees can be seen in a Toronto economic modeling study I mentioned in my paper that found licensed childcare unaffordable for 75% of families in Toronto. Childcare policy in the United States is within state jurisdiction. As such, fees, subsidies, and programs vary per state. I've listed a few examples of some of the lowest and highest costs for childcare on this slide. The range is quite drastic, between $453 US per month for childcare in Mississippi to over $2,000 per month in Washington, D.C. The federal government provides funding to each state through subsidies and tax credits. These types of market-based instruments are quintessential of a liberal welfare regime. Some of the major federal initiatives in the United States are listed here on this slide. Childcare in the United States is one of the biggest expenses families face. In my research, I found that only 12 states have made their tax credit partially or fully refundable. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services concludes that affordable childcare should not exceed 7% of a family income. There's only one state, Louisiana, that meets that criteria. Childcare is simply unaffordable for the majority of working families and a stretch for many others. I'll also note here that, as I mentioned earlier in Sweden, the maximum percentage of a family's income that would go towards childcare would be 3% for one child, up to 6% for 3+ children. The United States and Ontario fit Esping-Anderson's criteria for liberal welfare regimes. The programs offered cater to low-income groups. Both systems rely on subsidies and tax credits, which are market-based policy instruments. They provide modest benefits and have strict entitlement rules. Overall, both systems are unaffordable for the average family. At this point, I hope it's evident that Quebec's model of childcare is socially democratic and Ontario's is liberal. This distinction is important to the reduction of inequality in Canada. Social democratic welfare regimes offering universal programs are designed to reduce inequality. Liberal welfare regimes are not, as they are the least generous of the three welfare regimes. Social democratic welfare regimes are more inclusive and strikingly more generous. Programs in social democratic welfare regimes are more affordable, which help raise a family's economic status and in turn lowers poverty levels. Social democratic welfare regimes have also been shown to increase women's participation in the labor force, especially when universal childcare programs are offered. In conclusion, these comparative studies have demonstrated that when welfare regimes are examined at the national level, they exclude the uniqueness of countries like Canada with highly decentralized governance systems and the vast variation in social policies occurring within provincial and territorial jurisdiction. Classifying Canada as a homogeneous liberal welfare regime does not accurately reflect the variances in social policies and programs within this country. Universal programs are designed to reduce inequality. Social democratic welfare regimes are incontestably more inclusive than liberal welfare regimes. Therefore, when we are looking to reduce inequality, the welfare regime type matters. If Canada is serious about reducing inequality, then it should implement a universal childcare program using Quebec's model as an example. Without a move towards universal childcare, children will continuously be disproportionately disadvantaged throughout Canada based on the province or territory they are born into. And these are some of the references of the material I use in my presentation. Thank you all so much for listening.
Okay, great presentation. Thank you very much, Vanessa. And then we'll go now to Yutaka.
Great, thank you, Vanessa and Megan. Those are great presentations. I just wanted to thank IPAC for being part of the award, and then also my professor at the University of Manitoba, Dr. Karine Levasseur, who nominated my paper for the Condo Award. And thanks to everyone who's here today. So my paper I completed as an undergrad in actually the same class that Vanessa completed her paper in. And mine was a case study of change in residential tenancies legislation, sort of housing policy in the provinces, but particularly in Ontario in 2017, because I was interested in looking at how policies are adopted and developed. In that case study, I drew on some theories proposed by John Kindon, Thomas Birkeland, Michael Howlett, and his co-authors, Alan McConnell and Anthony Pearl. So the public policy process is often described in terms of a cycle. A problem is identified and defined, solutions are formulated, a decision is made to adopt a preferred option, the policy is then implemented, that new policy is then evaluated and then giving rise to the identification of new problems. Exactly how some problems are identified or defined and not others, which is sort of the agenda setting point on this policy cycle model depicted in the picture, and why particular solutions are identified is the subject of a significant body of literature. So Birkeland argues that the focusing event is one way to describe or identify why a particular policy problem gets onto the agenda. Birkeland defines a focusing event as an event that's sudden, relatively uncommon, can be reasonably defined as harmful or revealing the possibility of potentially greater future harms, that those harms are concentrated in a particular geographical area or community of interest, which is known to policymakers and the public simultaneously. So focusing events are sort of dramatic, and they open up a window of opportunity for experts, interest groups, or policy entrepreneurs to put forward their preferred definition of a pre-existing problem and its solution. They're often a subject of news stories, and they provide less powerful interest groups an opportunity to use these crises and the symbols generated during them to advance their policy change goals. Kingdon argues that there are three streams of policy: the policy stream, which deals with issues in the world with potential for policy responses; the policy stream, which includes policy proposals from policymakers, experts, and interest groups; and the politics stream, which deals with government elections and the pressures of public opinion on politicians. This model of policy streams and focusing events centers on explaining agenda setting, so how a particular issue gets on the agenda of decision makers in government, but it focuses on that sort of to the exclusion of all others. It's only the first stage in the policy cycle, and it doesn't offer a theory of how particular policies are formed and decided upon. So also of note, sort of as these streams come together, can be represented by a focusing event that brings together the problems that are out there, the policies that are being advanced by different groups, and of course, the interest of the politicians in addressing that issue. So because of the sort of limitations of this three-stream model, Hallett and his co-authors created sort of an updated model. And my paper case study sort of examines this updated model to see how well it explains a policy change in Ontario. So they propose a 5-stream confluence model of the policy process, adding 2 streams to Kingdon's model, particularly a process stream and a program stream. The 5-stream confluence model begins with the problem, policy, and politics stream, operating independently as described by Kingdon. So in that case, it's begins in the same way as the previous model, until those streams converge into a whirlpool at the agenda setting stage of the policy process. So again, that confluence can be triggered by a focusing event, which brings the issue, the policy makers or policy entrepreneurs and the politicians together to sort of identify the issue as an important one that needs to be responded to in some way by policy. The next stage introduces the process stream, which is designed to examine options and support authoritative decisions, and which establishes the course of the policy process. Also introduced after this whirlpool confluence is the program stream, which calibrates new program instruments and integrates them with established ones. The 5 streams are then part of the policy formation and decision-making point or second confluence of the policy process. So this model is interesting and an improvement on the previous model because it's able to explain not only how problems are identified and make it onto the policy agenda of government, but how the solutions are developed and decided upon by policymakers. It's able to do so largely because the authors envision the 5 streams after their confluence, so after they come together, as being able to retain their independence and offer and exert differing levels of influence on the process as a whole. So they use the example of a dominant process stream might denote a policy outcome that was largely a placebo. So where no clear solutions exist and simply publicly noting the issue was sufficient. So the government responds with something that doesn't actually address the problem. Whereas a dominant problem stream, in contrast, might produce a policy that was rational and tailored to the problem without concern for political or economic or social pressures. So they might actually say, this is the real solution to the problem. And regardless of how public opinion feels about it, this is a solution we're going to bring about. So they use this model in some ways to identify, like, with the result of the policy that comes out of this black box of policy making and government, they can sort of backtrack and say, well, we think it's because a particular one of our 5 streams was dominant during the policy making process. So in order to evaluate how effective this model was in actually explaining policy change in government, I used a case study of rental housing legislative change in Ontario. So, which I was familiar with because I worked for about 10 years for a community legal clinic in Ontario that specifically dealt with rental housing legislation. So I know a bit of the policy change process from the outside. So in Ontario, rents, similar to in Manitoba, rent increases are mandated annually with the sort of upper limit set by the province. These limits applied to most units in Ontario between 1991 and 2017, with the exception of rental apartments that were built after 1991. So this exemption was put in place by Mike Harris in 1997 under the Tenant Protection Act, which was, the exemption was meant to encourage the construction of new rental properties built after 1991. So the logic there was that if developers were told they didn't have these rent regulations placed on them, there would be more incentive for them to build new rental housing, which was a need for Ontarians. So this was, so it meant that after 1991, every building that was built wasn't covered by rent regulation, whereas older units were. So with the election of the Liberals, they pledged to replace the Tenant Protection Act and did so in 2006 with the Residential Tenancies Act. But despite a lot of tenant advocates sort of in the consultation process leading up to this legislation, calling for the removal of this loophole, the Ontario Liberal government did not remove the rent regulation new building exemption. So in 2010, the government announced that it would develop a long-term affordable housing strategy, and it offered tenant advocates and tenants and social housing providers and private landlords an opportunity to voice their concerns with the policy environment dealing with housing, and created a long-term affordable housing strategy, which they released in 2010 after a fairly large and involved consultation process. There were minor reforms to the Residential Tenancies Act, but they didn't include removing this new building exemption, which many tenant advocates did bring up directly to government in that process. In 2013, the NDP introduced a private members bill called the Rta Amendment Act, specifically to address this new building exemption. This was in response to sort of a spate of news stories where tenants who were living in buildings that were built after 1991 experienced an 18% increase in their rent, which was totally legal, despite the fact that the annual rent increase guideline at the time was only 2.5%, because their buildings were built after 1991. Of course, as a private members bill, it didn't have the support of the government and it wasn't passed, but that's an example of the policy solution and the problem being clearly on the government's radar for a significant amount of time. Then in 2017, a news story by a CBC reporter who recounted her experience of becoming homeless because she lived in a condo built after 1991 and she was a renter, and she experienced a $950 a month rent increase, which was perfectly legal under the legislation. So this story went viral. Hundreds of people, because she was a CBC reporter and a middle-class person, it sort of touched a nerve, and a lot of other people, hundreds of people responded to a public forum that CBC had set up in response to the interest that the story had gotten or given. And so suddenly this was again on the government's radar, but really in a way that it hadn't been before. And so I sort of theorized that this is a focusing event, sort of pointing to a specific harm that was geographically located, that was a pre-existing problem that was suddenly made aware both to politicians and policy makers and the public at the same time. Just a few weeks after that, the NDP again tabled a private members bill that was substantially the same as the bill they tabled in 2013. The same year, almost 2 months to the day, to the release of this story by Shannon Martin, the government reversed course and introduced as sort of one part of a package of policy reforms related to housing, Bill 124, the Rental Fairness Act, which removed this new building rent regulation exemption. So using this example of policy change, I'm interested in exploring the applicability of the Howlett 5-stream model. So in the case of the 1991 rent exemption, the problem stream, represented by affected tenants and their advocates, and the policy stream were largely aligned, not only on the identification of the problem, the rent gouging by landlords who were able to do this legally, but on its solution, so the repeal of the exemption. And this happened prior to the focusing event as early as 2013, as I described. This alignment, however, did not produce a change in policy. The response to government from advocates at the time who could report to reports and evidence presented previously to policymakers was to double down on the policy. Absent the focusing event, alignment of the several streams were insufficient to compel policy change. But when the focusing event occurred, that viral story, and the program stream, which is represented by bureaucrats in the Ministry of Housing who are well aware of the problem and of the policy solution, joined in the policy formation stage as per Howlett's model. They did so, as I said, already been aware of and fully having canvassed the issue and possible solutions. So this opened a further window for policy advocates. The proposal advanced prior to the focusing event through the problem and policy stream was a clear, simple, and specific one. So the majority of the streams in this case were aligned at the point that the issue became part of the government's agenda after the focusing event. So the resulting policy change, consistent with the positions of each aligned stream, suggests that it's the importance of stream alignment rather than dominance to the policy decision. Disentangling the influence of a group of aligned streams from that of a dominant stream is not so simple. So Howlett argues that one particular stream might be dominant and that can explain policy change, whereas this example, I think, brings up a problem with the model, which is what my paper concluded with, is that the model is unable to tell the difference between the dominance of the policy stream or a particular stream and the alignment of several streams together, creating a dominant alignment. So in the black box of policy decisions by government, the dominance of one stream, particularly that of the politics stream, for example, may be indistinguishable from the combined dominance through alignment of several or all of the other streams. So that's the conclusion I reached, that in fact, this model is a definite improvement on previous models in explaining how government arrives at a policy decision and implements it, because it addresses some of the other aspects, but it's still sort of insufficient to explain, is it the one stream that's dominating, or is it a alignment of several streams who all are acting together that produce that dominance and produce that policy result? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Yutaka. So if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. I have a couple, but I don't want to dominate the discussion. We have a few minutes left. So while we wait to see if anyone has more questions, Vanessa, I have a question for you, and that is, do you see the federal government's major agenda on early learning childcare and the whole idea of $10 a day across the country moving us closer to the social democratic model?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just a note, I did actually write this paper before the government had mentioned this initiative. So yeah, I think that it does in a sense. There are two caveats I would say though with that I didn't actually get to address in my paper due to the length. But I think with this type of model, you have to be really sure that you create enough spaces for children. So that might mean building more daycares, hiring more staff. There's no point in having a $10 a day or an $850 a day care policy if people can't access those spaces. And then also, I think another issue is ensuring that we're paying childcare workers reasonable wages. So at least in Manitoba here, the wages are quite low, notably in Sweden. You have to have professional certification if you're on a permanent contract. So there's an actual curriculum too for preschool, which I think is really interesting. So yeah, to answer your question, I think it does move us a bit closer. I think in terms of equality between genders and costs between provinces, most certainly, but there are other aspects to consider as well with implementing that type of policy.
Great, thank you. Seeing no questions in the chat, I have one for Meagan as well. So Meagan, your paper in your presentation dissect this current regime, and I think very effectively point to the fact that it's cumbersome and complicated and not conducive to further maritime tourism in the north. I have a question that, and it's much more complicated than we have time for. But for me, the starting point is that a bad thing? Is it necessarily beneficial to have more Arctic tourism? And I'm sure you have a very complicated answer. Do you have like a 30-second answer?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think there are a couple good reasons to simplify the permitting process. First one, it's, you know, I think common knowledge that really complex regulatory regimes increase the risk of non-compliance. So by having this really complicated permit system, I think you're actually increasing the risk that operators either accidentally miss important requirements, and which will increase the risk for environmental harm, or they just make the decision to, you know, due to the cost of compliance, that they just won't comply. You know, the other thing is tourism offers northern residents the opportunity to, I guess, to participate in the cultural economy. So it supports, you know, artists and performers, and you know, there's a high concentration of artists in the north. So and one of the problems with it, though, is that they don't have access to markets. You know, there's often, they don't earn a livable wage, northern artists, because they don't have, there's not a market for their products in many circumstances. So I think tourism can be good. I think it needs to be managed well. You know, again, I think it's important to have all of these regulations in place, particularly, you know, given the risk to the environment. And I don't think my paper necessarily endorses, you know, the big ship, the big Crystal Serenity that went through in 2016. I think, you know, I won't make any comments on that, but for smaller operations, I do think, yes, there's many benefits aside from, you know, the socio-cultural benefits, or you know, to prevent environmental incidents and increase compliance. It's also, these are very socioeconomically disadvantaged communities, and I think regional development just broadly is good.
Okay, thank you, Meagan. So we are at time, and I want to respect our presenters' times. I know they're all busy doing other things. So thanks very much to all three of you for this presentation. This has been recorded and will be posted on YouTube, and we'll let you know when that's available. But thanks again, and have a great afternoon.